Hi, it's Janet. Writing Wednesday. We are postponed until now, so thanks for joining me. You're going to hear sirens and helicopters in the background. It is the world is being reshuffled, and it is it's a moment. I've had like 2 or 3 hours sleep. Um, it is the world is being remade because people are deciding that it's time and gathering together to do it. And big things are being decided. It is true. I had a question that was asked of me that very much pertains to this, which is from Toby, if you're on. Hi, Susie. She writes, "Hi, Janet. I left a question comment last week regarding your comment about writing poetry." Now, most of us are fiction writers, so I am a great believer in fiction writers writing poetry, even if it's lousy. Nobody says you have to send it to the New Yorker, but it hones your skills and it sensitizes your ear, makes you far more aware of the shapes of words and the potency of words as you line them up. And hi, Toby. I read poetry for enjoyment and to improve my language. I used to write poetry in junior high through college, but I'm sure it was terrible stuff. I find myself wanting to write it again for the pleasure of it. Could you talk more about what makes a good books to read, online classes to participate in, etc.? I am a fiction writer. I write a lot of poetry in my journals. Sometimes it's the only way I can get my thoughts out, are in those short lines. You can breathe. You get to the end of the line. So when it's intense, moving it down the page with line breaks gives the writer some time to catch up to their thoughts. And I've said in reference to Marina M., in reference to the Russian Silver Age, which my last 2 books were about, the Russian Revolution was the Silver Age of poetry. And I'm a fiction writer, I know a lot, but when events change very quickly, it favors the poets who respond to the moment with something that doesn't have to have a narrative arc. It responds to the feelings of the moment, and you might have many feelings. So you can write a poem about, your your outrage, a poem about hope. You can write a poem about despair, and just get it out there. You can react to a single incident. Poetry deals with the impressions of a moment, or it can, especially for fiction writers who, it takes such a long time to construct that arc and what we're going to say in immediate response to immediate things. Fiction writers have to, especially novelists, have to digest what's going on. That's why after any kind of big event, you do not see the fiction coming out for a while. The event, the poets and the non-fiction writers, of course, the essayists are right there. The fiction writers take longer to digest. So it's a good time, if you've ever been interested in writing some poetry, to at it. If you have things to express. I know for myself, big events happen like this and it kind of stuns you into silence, which is the wrong way to go. It's much better to allow the, express all the clashing feelings, all the clashing impressions. What happens is the silence, that leaden silence, I have nothing to say, it's just too big, is because everything's trying to get through the door at the same time. So if you back off and let in a poem this one through, this one through, then we have the question of whether it's good or not, how to make it good. I think the first impulse is, think in terms of expressing something that you want to say, and work with that expression until it's said something that to embody. So not just a bleat of terror, a bleat of something, but just like work with it, and it'll unlock, and there'll be more. And sometimes it's just the sound of the words that you start using. Read it out loud and notice if there's that's emerging, if there's an E or an O, or there's a lot of T's, like what is the sound of the helicopter overhead? What is the sound when the helicopter lowers on blows them off the street? Details, you could hang it on details, and there are a lot of wonderful poets to be reading now, and you read them for your enjoyment or your appreciation of the expression. How to write better poems, it's always something to play with. Anything that you language arts that you are handling will for fiction writing. Toby asked, is there books to read, online classes to participate in? What makes good poetry? As there are anybody else. They pay attention to compression. They pay attention to the line. There's a wonderful broadcast by the Rattlecast, where Tim Green, who is the editor of Rattle Magazine, a poetry magazine, actually goes through people's poems and line, so you can see it. That's a really good one, the Rattlecast. I did one of those massive online classes through Iowa that was poetry, and they just had the most remarkable, through the Iowa Writers Program, the most remarkable teachers, and talking about poetry, and super inspiring. And you could probably dig that up somewhere and do that. They offer it, they toggle with the fiction, but just reading really good poetry, start to notice certain things about the way language works, sound works. Good poets to read now: Claudia Rankine, Wanda Coleman. There's a new anthology of Wanda Coleman out called oh my God, what's the new one called? It's brand new and way worth getting. Evie Shockley and Robin Costa Lewis. A really good time to read Black poets, and you'll take them in at a level that you wouldn't have taken them in at before. As far as doing your own, having your own expression, you're going to have feelings about things, and it's just how personal can you make it? Can you find the detail that expresses your feeling? Maybe not talking about a soldier, but talking about a soldier, some small detail about that soldier on the street, as you're staring him in the eye, or as, you're watching this unfold. But poetry, it reacts faster. And this just might be a golden age of poetry right now. So keep watching, follow poets, and see what they're saying, see what they're posting. how to write better poetry, if you want to start writing poetry and think about it, think about language, think about reading it out loud and cutting out the unnecessary. Will sharpen your hand for anything that you decide to do. I really, to me, sound is so important. You know, write a blues, write something that will attach you to the moment, if you'd like, or try a form. I taught poetry to ninth graders, and I found poetry, they had a bit easier time writing in form, writing sonnets and whatever, than they did with free verse. So everybody's different about this. But it's a good time to read poetry because we're super sensitized, and I seem to be reaching out to that very intimate, direct voice that poetry has. Other questions here are, here's a question. Okay, so here's Sylvia's question. Sylvia has been asking this, and I didn't answer her, and it needs to be answered, which is how do you find an author's mailing address so that you can send a fan letter? If anybody likes to, writers love to hear from people who've read their stuff and have something to say about it. You know, we write often into a vacuum. I think that's one of the reasons people go on social media, is they can see reaction right there. When you're writing, you know, poetry, when you're writing fiction, you don't necessarily hear from people who are touched by it, moved by it. As far as getting that missive to the writer, you write to the publisher or to the agent, and normally you send the letter to them and then they forward it. Very few will give you the writer's address. That just isn't done. And I should say writers often prefer email. You know, so many people aren't emailers anymore. They like to text or whatever. But writers like an email because if they want to respond, it's easier to respond. And then they don't have to give their, you know, where to find them if you're a, you know, crazed fan. Many people have a post office box. Often that will be, if they want people to send to them, it will be on their website. But generally we're in an electronic age. When people get a, you know, a physical letter, then it demands a physical letter back, unless it has an email, which usually people don't think to put in a physical letter. So it demands they then sit down and write a, you know, write a clear letter, rewrite it, and you often will wait a very long time to hear from a writer these days with a physical letter. I recommend email. But it's nice to get if you send somebody a physical letter, send them a short one, a card, so they don't feel like they, you know, the big weight of you're waiting to hear from them on all these points. If you just want to give them something that they can have, that's a nice thing to do. So here's another one. This was an interesting question from Brenda, who asked, I'm happy with the first third of my novel and the last, but something's gone wrong in the middle. There are things that must happen to get from the start to the end, but it feels like the scenes I've created are mere vehicles to make sure that one key thing happens. Do you have any techniques for making the middle of a novel as exciting as the beginning and the end? Okay. Well, this tells me that it's, if you have the sagging middle problem, it's usually that nothing happens in the individual scenes, so that they start and end in the same place. It doesn't move the plot along. It doesn't move the story along. Nothing happens except for that one key thing. So you have to explore each scene that you decide to use and say, does this advance or in some way change the story, change the protagonist. You know, if the protagonist comes in grumpy and leaves grumpy, nothing happened. You don't need the scene. It has to change the protagonist. It has to, they can't go back to the way it was before. So it's like having a step. If you have a stair, but the character doesn't climb it, then you don't need the stair, right? If there's only one thing that happens between the opening and the closing, you need to go back and explore what else you've set up. It's in there, other moves, but you have to explore other moves that will lead you more incrementally to whatever it is. The big reveal, the big climax, the big scene isn't enough. You know, the character struggles to solve his or her problem, and they struggle in different dimensions, on different axes. And, you know, think about the different ways the character is trying to solve their problem, not just in one direction. You know, I'm trying to get the raise. I'm trying to get the raise. Oh, I don't get the raise. And then I move on, whatever. But no, you know, in that urge to get the raise, other things happen. Oh, your brother wants you to do this, and then you're late for the meeting, and then you screw it up, and then some, you know, and then something else happens, and, you know, so all the things that conspire to derail this person's attempt to get that raise, that's what's going to intervene. And think about orchestration of scene. So some, you know, will be very intense, and then what will be a release, and then more intense. One person, two people, group scenes, night, day. You know, when you start to think about what's involved in the creation of a scene, the different ways a scene can go. Sometimes just changing, saying I need a night scene in here, sometimes will be the little spark that will unlock it for you. Everybody has that problem. Most people have a problem. They just have the beginning. I mean, that's me. I have the beginning. I don't even know what the ending is. So I go with what I know, and then what happens. I think sometimes you think you have an ending. Maybe you think you have an ending, and maybe that's not the ending. So think about what do you see clearly, rather than trying to go from one thing to the other. Sometimes it's just, what can I see clearly? Write that scene, throw it in a box. What do I see clearly? Write that scene, throw it in a box. If you don't see anything clearly in that middle section, only the beginning and the end, maybe you can cut it up. Maybe you can pull stuff from the ending and chop it up inside the beginning, and then work like, you know, like knives, like this, you know, and chop it together. If you read The Lover by Marguerite Duras, the beginning, you know, the past story and the present story, and the present is not a story, it's just a standpoint, are chopped up, and they go from one to the other. So that's a technique that works. But yeah, no flabby middles. You know, any place the reader can stop, they will stop. So everything has to be interesting. Everything has to have propulsion. Don't think that it waits to the big reveal. You know, nobody cares about the big reveal only counts as if you've been in suspense all the way through. Otherwise, it's just, oh God, I waited through all of that just for that. So, you know, really, how do you give that suspense? How do you give that propulsion to the next scene, and the next scene, and the next scene? And feel free to break the chronology if it wouldn't be too confusing for the reader. Look at a different form. There's a braided form, you know, like where you take points of view of different people and you weave them together. So when you run out of what you could say about Sherry at this point, then you bring in Matt, and you do Matt for a while, and then you do Teresa, and you braid them back and forth. That's an interesting form. So sometimes form will save you. And let's see, and then I had one other question. But yeah, the sagging middle, do not, yeah, you can't do that. And then Tony asked about subtext, how to use it in dialogue specifically. Now, subtext is the mother's milk of good dialogue. I have a couple of Writing Wednesdays on dialogue. You can go back and see. The subtext is why the best dialogue is between people who know each other very well. So they don't have to say much, or they can talk about tuna sandwich in a way that is talking more about their marriage. So subtext is, don't make it like that. I hate mustard, and it's like, I'm not putting too much mustard in there. Whatever the surface conversation is, but then there's this conversation underneath it, which is saying, you can't fill my needs the way I need them. You never listen to me. And the other's like, you're always trying to tell me how to be there for you. I'm trying, but nothing's ever good enough, and they can never mention that at all. That's the most interesting kind of dialogue, is that the dialogue is not about what people are talking about. That's why children are always confused by adults, because they're not talking about what they're, how can they get so mad about something so stupid as to who was president in 1923? It's because it's not about that at all. And subtext is also, you can use it in the landscape. Landscape can always comment. So husband and wife at a table at a restaurant, cafe, remember that? And they look at something and they see this young couple maybe walks by holding hands. The landscape can comment on the action that way. Objects can comment on the action. But dialogue, in the subtext in the dialogue, is symbolic. What they're talking about is symbolizes. There's a wonderful scene in Played as It Lays, which has small dialogue chapters, like one page, where the husband wants the wife to come out to the beach house of this guy who's producing a film, come out and swim. And she goes, well, I don't want to swim. And he goes, well, he might finance my movie. Now, what is that all about? It's just complete subtext. He wants her to swan around in her bikini or less to try to, as a come on to the producer. So he's basically saying, I need you to, do a little sex scene with this guy so we can get the money. And she's saying no. And that's what she's saying no to, not I don't want to go swimming. There's a wonderful scene in Bear and His Daughter, Robert Stone's short story collection, called a story called Por qué no tiene, por qué la falta, where they talk about, there's a lot of subtext in it, like somebody saw a manta ray, and it's like, oh no, he didn't see the manta ray, or, it's this subtext of disloyalty underneath a conversation about the manta ray. That's done very well. So the subtext is always the best part. So I wanted to, is there anything else I can talk about? The sagging middle. Right now I'm working on a book that I'm having a lot of problems with. I find, in a time of kind of lower energy level and extreme oversensitivity, which is, natural at this time, I'm having trouble writing the book that I'm writing, because it demands a certain amount of emotional intensity and fortitude and not fudging. And I find myself not wanting to be in that conflict right now. It's like I don't have the emotional energy to make that the scene the scene that it needs to be. I tend to, I'm veering off into a kind of a softer mood, and it's not what the book is demanding. And so it's like I have to deal with that. I'm not going to write a softball thing just because that's all I can do right now. I'd rather put that aside, write something more emotionally harmonious with what I'm feeling right now, a small exercise, poetry. I can do it in poetry. The intensity works for me if I'm writing something short. But to write a story, I think I'm going to start, go back to writing exercises and shorts for a while until I can have the fortitude to write the tough stuff that I have been writing and need to write. So if there's anything I can talk to you about, I will. And otherwise, I want to wish you a happy Writing Wednesday. I hope that you get some express yourself, even if it's going to do a writing prompt, even if it's writing some poetry, writing some verse instead of fiction, just describing how you feel, what you see, what you hear, what this moment means to you. Expression is always healing. It's always healing. So, hope to see you next week, and thank you for watching.